the more likely will be the system of confounders. The third condition is that the food and beverage establishment quickly react to change in the local demand due to the lower startup cost. Well, when we were thinking about doing this paper, we don't only choose the food and beverage sector as the main activity that is affected by Airbnb. We also choose this sector because it's a kind of activity that reacts quickly to change in the local demand. So we were expecting to observe some change in the urban areas surrounding the accommodation. And finally, the urban geography shapes consumption patterns, stressing the role of local consumption amenities. Broadly speaking, what we are seeing here is that Airbnb users tend to spend a high proportion of his time budget in the nearby areas of their accommodation. In turn, this can imply a transformation of the urban landscape of those areas. So, yes.
The first 3 points are like some assumptions or starting points, but I don't really get the fourth one here, like a finding.
No, the fourth one is an empirical finding, also theoretical finding, that in the urban economics literature, in particular the literature of urban consumption, found that people, not only residents, but also tourists, try to spend a high proportion of his time budget, but also of his budget, in the nearby areas where they live. So this is a condition that are going to allow us to see a local effect of in the nearby areas of these Airbnbs. So
sorry, Alberto, sorry if I interrupt you, just to let know to Marco that we can't hear the questions from the floor. We can hear you, but we couldn't hear the questions. So I don't know whether Marco can actually pass the mic to the speakers when they ask, okay?
Okay.
Thank you very much. Sorry for having.
Sorry, Sandro. I think this mic does not really work, the other one. So if there are people that would like to ask you something, probably they should come here and ask on the mic. We also have the other mic there, okay?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the main research question that we are going to try to answer in this paper are the following ones. Firstly, to what extent are local shops positively affected by Airbnb? And in the second place, are the Airbnb economic spillover effects the same across the urban geography, or there are some areas more beneficiated than the others? Well, to be able to answer those research questions, we firstly must solve for the endogeneity problem in our main variable of interest, that is the number of Airbnb or the number of Airbnb rooms. And this endogeneity comes from the non-random location of the short-term rentals within the city. So to try to solve for this issue, we apply an instrumental variable strategy, and in particular, we use a Bartik-like instrument. A Bartik-like instrument is composed by the interaction of two components. A fixed component that is known in the literature with the name of share, that in our case will be the number of rented houses in 2011, that is before the arrival of Airbnb, and a temporal component that in the literature is called with the name of shift, that in our case will be the worldwide Airbnb Google searches on Google. So this Bartik-like instrument, because it's not a Bartik instrument, it's similar to a Bartik instrument, is composed, as I say, by the interaction of those two components. The first component, the number of rented houses in 2011, are going to allow us to identify in which areas of the cities there were before the Airbnb entry in Madrid a high number of rented houses, and we expect that afterwards there will be a high number of short rentals. Why? Because the main mechanism through which Airbnb supplies is based is, as I say, in already existing dwellings, that in the past they have long-term rental contracts, but due to the disruption of Airbnb technology, they switch from long-term rental contracts to short-term rental contracts due to the high probability of this last option. So, as I say, this first component are going to allow us to identify in which areas of the city there will be afterwards a high or a lower number of Airbnb. But this component is fixed in time. I mean, it doesn't vary. That's why we have to interact this component with the shift, that is a temporal component, and we will use the number of worldwide Airbnb Google searches. So the number of times that people search the word Airbnb on Google. Why we are using this component? Because the main idea behind this instrument is that the more likely people is aware about the system of this platform, the more likely will be that some of them switch from long-term rental contract to short-term rental contracts due to the high probability of this last option. I will give you a more detailed explanation about the Bartik instrument and the identification strategy in the empirical section. Well, as a preview of the results, let me show you that Airbnb, we find that Airbnb is positively affecting some local consumption amenities. To give you some numbers, an increase in 10 Airbnb rooms in a given census tract translates to 1 more restaurants. And the same increase in a given neighborhood generates 9 new tourist-related employees. Well, interestingly, we don't only find positive effects in the local consumption amenities, but those effects are heterogeneous, either across space, being the areas less touristic, the most beneficiated by the arrival of Airbnb, which reinforces the idea that Airbnb can be used to redistribute the benefits of the tourism across the city. And also there are heterogeneous effects within the sector, being the restaurants and the bars, the main activities beneficiated by the arrival of Airbnb. Well, as I say, the main mechanism that we are exploiting here is a neighborhood demographic composition change. So Airbnb substitutes residents for tourists. And in turn, it is expected that the substitution of those kind of new residents transform the area in the nearby areas of their accommodation. Well, the rest of the presentation is organized as follows. Now I'm going to do a very briefly revision of the literature. Then I will jump to the data and I will focus the bulk of my presentation in the empirical strategy. Then I will present the results and I will try to show you very briefly also the robustness checks that we do in order to try to convince you that our results are robust. And I will finish the presentation with the usual conclusions. Well, the literature review. Well, our paper is framed within 2 lines of research. Firstly, on the one hand, this paper is framed within a line of research that tries to identify the potential economic impacts of the platform economy, in particular, the accommodation platform economy. Here we have some contributions that have analyzed the effect of Airbnb on the housing sector. For instance, the paper of Garcia Lopez and co-authors and Barro and co-authors, that they focus in the effect of Airbnb in housing affordability, in particular, the effect that has Airbnb on the housing and in the rental prices. They find that, in fact, Airbnb is behind the rise in the housing and the rental prices. We have also some papers that have focused on the effect in the traditional accommodation, that is the unfair competition between Airbnb and hotels. For instance, here we have the contribution of Cervas and co-authors that analyze how the entry of Airbnb to the state of Texas affected the performance of the traditional accommodations. They found that even though Airbnb doesn't affect the high-ranked hotels, they affect the performance of the low-ranked hotels. And finally, we have a plot of papers that analyze, in a much broader sense, the effect of Airbnb in the local economy. Also, our paper is framed within another long-established line of research in the urban economics literature that try to study the importance of the consumption amenities. For instance, in those kind of papers that you are seeing here, they explain, for instance, what are the determinants of the consumption amenities, why are distributed across the city, and importantly, the spatial friction in the urban consumption. That, as I was saying before, this is related that residents tend to spend a high proportion of this budget in the nearby areas where they live. Well, the main contribution of this paper with respect to those 2 lines of research are the following one. Firstly, we saw empirically the existence of the local effects. Using a finite granular data set for the universe of all economic activities in Madrid are going to allow us to identify the Airbnb using the smaller unit available, the smaller geographical unit available, that are the census tract. The census tract, as you're going to see here, are not in terms of size that the census tract in USA, are much, much smaller. And why it's important to use this kind of geographical unit of analysis? Because as I was saying at the beginning, we are expecting local effects. More importantly, we also find that the effects are heterogeneous across activities. On the methodological ground, we propose a new instrument to solve for the endogeneity in the Airbnb problem, and our instrument is quite generalized to any kind of context, as it is based in some variables that are free in any country. They are based in variables that they are available in the census in each country or in Google Trends. So it can be easily to generalize. Well, the data. Our main unit of analysis will be the census tracts, but in some specification we will use also the neighborhoods due to data limitation, and you will see. Well, for those of you who doesn't know how Madrid is administratively divided, let me show you the following map. Well, here you can see that Madrid is divided in districts. Inside the district, you see the neighborhoods, and inside the neighborhood, we have the census tract. The census tract, as you see, are small units, small areas, and will be our main unit of analysis. Well, our time frame goes to March 2014 to December 2018 in a quarterly basis. Regarding the different sources of information, we use data, for instance, or the data of the local consumption amenities are collected from the Madrid City Council census of business premises. That this data set provides data, establishment level data, under a 4-digit nest-based classification, the location, the georeferenced data, and also the activity status, whether it is open, is closed, is under reform. Okay, those are the activities that we are going to use here. So the local consumption amenities we are identifying with the bars, the restaurants, the coffees, bars with kitchen, coffee with performance. These are the kind of activities that we expect that are affected by the arrival of Airbnb, since they are tourist oriented. Well, the data for the employment, as I say, is only available at the neighborhood level. That's why some specification we only can run it at the neighborhood level. And this data has been provided for the Social Security General Treasury of Spain and is confidential data. The information for the short-term rentals is obtained from inside Airbnb, and inside Airbnb is a website that collects web scrape data of this platform. Finally, we collect some other variables that they are socio-demographic, housing, and hotel information to build our control variables and to build our instrument. The information of the hotel data comes from web scrape data from Spain. Well, let me show you here a couple of graphs that are going to help us or help me to motivate our research question. Well, here in the following graph, you can see the evolution of the short-term rentals in the green bars, the evolution of the local consumption amenities, the restaurant, the food and beverage establishments in the green dots, and the evolution of the hotel rooms. Well, two conclusions can be extracted from this graph. Firstly, it seems that it exists a positive correlation between the increase in the short-term rentals, the green bars, and the increase in the local consumption amenities. But at the same time, we do not observe a great change in the number of hotel rooms in the city. Again, this is a nice feature since we are focusing in a city like Madrid that in the year that we analyzed didn't experiment a tourism revival. And what is the problem if we pick at a city that it was experimenting a tourism revival? The problem is that we will not be able to identify whether the change in the local consumption amenities is due to Airbnb, is due to the traditional accommodation, or is due to a combination of both. Well, here in the following maps, you can see the spatial distribution in 2 moments in time, at the beginning of our sample and at the end of our sample, of the number of short-term rentals. The white lines are the borders of the neighborhoods, and inside the white lines, you can see the different colors, the different intensity, and they stand for the census tracts. So we can see here that Airbnb at the beginning of the period is mainly concentrated in the city center. Even though at the end of the sample, we still see that Airbnb, as it was expected, is focused in the city center, we start to observe some census tracts and neighborhoods that they are start to experiment a high number of short-term rentals. These or those will be important in our analysis, since in those areas will be easy to us to identify the causal effect of Airbnb on the local consumption amenities, since in those areas Airbnb will be the only accommodation actor. Well, the empirical strategy. At the end of the day, in our paper, we try to answer the following research question. We want to see whether the arrival of Airbnb to a census tract I in the quarter T affected the number of consumption amenities or the employment in these consumption amenities. We are going to control for other variables that has been so relevant in the literature, like the population, the proportion of the foreign population, or the number of hotel rooms. Finally, we extend our specification controlling for time and census tract fixed effects, quarter fixed effects. However, our main coefficient of interest, beta, suffers from the main problem that Airbnb maybe is an endogenous variable. And where does it come, the endogeneity here? Well, it could come from the reverse causality problem. Here we are saying that Airbnb is the one that explains the posterior growth in the number of consumption amenities. But it could be on the other way around, that the host of the Airbnb select those places in the city where there are a high number of restaurants and bars. Why? For those of you who have ever booked an Airbnb, you will probably see that a short description of the flat, the host usually try to sell its flat saying, okay, the Airbnb is surrounded by restaurant, by coffee, so it's a kind of amenity that attract tourists. So if it is the case, we will have a problem. The second problem comes from the collocation of the Airbnb and the traditional accommodation. As I showed you before, we see that Airbnb is mainly concentrated in the city center. But obviously, the traditional accommodation also are concentrated in the city center. So it will, even though if we are controlling for the supply, that is, we are controlling during our time frame, if a new hotel is open, we are not controlling for the demand side. So if there are more tourists in Madrid and these tourists goes to the hotels, the increase in the number of consumption amenities will be a combination of the increase in the Airbnb, in the short-term rentals, and also the increase in the demand of the traditional accommodation. Well, for this first issue, we apply an instrumental variable strategy. And in particular, we use a Bartik-like instrument. As I said before, a Bartik-like instrument is composed by the interaction of two components. A fixed component that is known with the literature with the name of share, that in our case will be the number of rented houses in 2011, that is before the arrival of Airbnb, and a temporal component that is called in the literature with the name of shift, that we will use the worldwide Airbnb Google searches. So again, the first component, the share, will give us the necessary cross-sectional variation. And we're exploiting here the main mechanism through which the number of short-term rental has grown. That is the switch from long-term rental contract to short-term rental contracts. So think about it that if we want to try to predict the number of Airbnb, we are picking some housing characteristics that are related with Airbnb afterwards. And these housing characteristics are the number of rented houses. Again, here we are predicting, we have the cross-sectional variation. So we know whether the census tract where there were a high number of rented houses, we will predict that will be a high number also of short-term rentals. But it's a fixed component, and our variable of interest, that is time varying, needs temporal variation. That's why we interact this component with a temporal component, as the shift, that we will use the number, the worldwide number of searches of the word Airbnb on Google. Again, the underlying idea about this instrument is that the more people are aware about the system of this platform, this kind of technology, it will be easier that some of them switch from long-term rental contract to short-term rental contracts due to the high probability of this last option. So as you can see here, our Bartik-like instrument shares some similarities with the shift-share instrument or Bartik instrument that has been used so far in the literature, for instance, in the trade or in the immigration. for those of you who have ever looked and read a paper that has been used, a Bartik instrument, you may came across with, for instance, an instrument for predicting the settlement of the immigrants. So the Bartik instrument has been used a lot in this kind of literature. In this literature, they instrument for the settlement of the immigrants using the past settlements of the immigrants 20 years ago, for instance. So our instrument shares some similarities here with this kind of literature. So we are predicting where the short-term rentals are going to be using the number of rented houses that were before the arrival of Airbnb. So once Airbnb has arrived, most of those rented houses has left the market and has gone from the long-term rental market to the short-term rental market. Well, let me show you some graphs that prove or show the relevance of our instrument. In the left hand graph, you can see in the x-axis the number of rented houses classified in the size, and in the y-axis you can see the global supply of Airbnb rooms. So this graph can be read as follows. It is true that in those areas where there were in the past a high number of rented houses, there are afterwards a high number of Airbnb rooms. According to the graph, it seems so. Okay, and the second graph is going to show you the relevance of the second component, the shift component. You can see here in the blue line the evolution of the number of Airbnb rooms, and in the green line the evolution of the searches of the worldwide searches of the word Airbnb on Google. So it seems that they are positive correlated. Well, with this empirical strategy, with our instrumental variable strategy, we are solved for the first problem, that is the reverse causality. But we still have to deal with the problem of the collocation of the traditional accommodations and the short-term rentals. So in order to deal with this problem, we decided to work with two different samples. A restricted sample where we filter and we remove all the observations that are in the city center of Madrid. And we identify the city center of Madrid as all the census tracts and all the neighborhoods that are within the district center. So the district center is this area that you can see here. And we choose this district because it's the district where all the tourist attractions are located. As I say, we decided to work with two different samples, a whole sample with all the neighborhoods and all the census tract, and unrestricted samples where we remove all the observations, since in the city center, it will be more likely that our instrument doesn't satisfy the exclusion restriction, and also we identify a compound effect, that the increase in the number of consumption amenities may be due to Airbnb, but also may be due to an increase in the demand of the traditional accommodation. But in the other areas, there are not almost any hotel, but there are Airbnb. So there were in those areas where we can claim more safely that our parameter of interest identify the causal effect. Well, now I'm going to show you the results. Firstly, I'm going to show the results for the OLS specification, and then I will move to the IB. Well, here you can see the result for OLS, either for the whole sample, that is for all the census tract, and for the restricted sample. Our main variable of interest here will be the number of food and beverage establishments, and we will control in for the population, the proportion of the foreign population, and the number of hotel rooms. As you can see here, regardless the specification that we use, that is even controlling for time varying variables, or we control for time varying variables plus census tract and quarter fixed effects, we find a positive and significant effect of the arrival of Airbnb on the local consumption activities. However, we cannot trust in this coefficient, as I said before, because it might suffer from the homogeneity problem of the main variable of interest. So we will use an instrumental variable strategy, but again, as you can see here, either in the whole sample or in the restricted sample, we find a positive and significant effect of the Airbnb on the local consumption amenities. More interestingly, the coefficient is higher in the restricted sample. So in those areas where we have removed all the observation, all the census tract in the city center, which may lead us to the conclusion that in the periphery of the city center is where the economic spillover of the Airbnb might be the higher. And why is that? It's because in those areas, the competition for the land use is lower than in the city center. If you think about in Rome, if you think about Madrid, Barcelona, Paris, in the city center, there is less scope to create more economic activity because almost all slots are occupied by some activity. But in the periphery of the city center, there is not this the case. And that is why we find a positive effect and a higher effect in magnitude in the restricted sample. Also, we see here that the coefficient for the population is quite lower in magnitude than the coefficient for the Airbnb rooms. If we measure or we interpret the coefficient for the population as a proxy for the residents and the coefficient for the Airbnb rooms as a proxy for the tourists, this confirms our initial claim that tourists has a different consumption patterns than residents, and in particular, tourists demand more intensively this kind of consumption amenities. Lastly, we don't see any significant effects in the coefficient attached to the hotel rooms variable. And this is mainly two reasons. Firstly, because we don't have so many variability. There are not so many hotels open during our time frame, but also because hotel rooms already provide some of these amenities inside their facilities. So there is less scope to increase the number of consumption amenities in the surrounding areas coming from the hotels. Well, now I'm going to show you the result for the employment. As you can see here, the number of observations has dramatically dropped up. And this is due to, as I said before, the employment information, we only have it available at the neighborhood level and at the annual level. For the sake of exposition, we decided to reproduce the same specification as before. That is where the dependent variable is the number of food and beverage establishment, but we aggregate all the information at the neighborhood and the year. Again, we find a positive and significant effect of the arrival of Airbnb on the employment in this sector, in these services, and the coefficient is higher. And it's higher due to two facts. The first fact is because logically, you cannot map to one an increase in one establishment to an increase in one employee. And why is that? Because normally the average size of the employees in an establishment is 5. So it's not fair to compare it. But more importantly, is because the coefficient of the employment variable is picking the intensive and the extensive margin. Why I'm talking about the intensive and the extensive margin? Well, the intensive margin is the increase in the employment for the already existing establishment. But it could also increase the employment for the new establishment. That will be the extensive margin. So after doing this kind of decomposition, we found that 1/3 of the increase in the employment is due to intensive margin, and this is logical. 2/3 are due to the extensive margin. Well, now over the paper, we do a series of complementary analysis, sensitivity analysis, and robustness check to show the validity of our results. Here, for instance, we decided, or we try to answer which activities are the ones that are beneficiated by the arrival of Airbnb. Remember that before we are aggregating all those activities as local consumption amenities, but it could be different, the effect of Airbnb in the restaurants, the effect of Airbnb in the bars, the effect of Airbnb in the coffees. And in fact, we find a positive and significant effect mainly in restaurants and coffees, as they are those activities that are more related to the tourists than bars that in Spain are more related to the locals. Well, over the paper, we are using a level specification, but we could use also a log specification or a Poisson model. So we decided to apply this kind of specification to see whether our main tenets hold or are specification dependent. And as you can see here, regardless the specification that we use, we find a positive and significant effect of Airbnb. So after ruling out the problem of a potential specification problem, we try to deal with another problem. So here we are saying Airbnb is behind the rise in the local consumption amenities. But a problem that we cannot observe in here is that maybe Airbnb is localizing in those areas that has been or are being gentrifying. And the gentrification is related with the growth of those consumption amenities. So if it is true, we were picking the joint effect of the gentrification and the joint effect of Airbnb. So to try to rule out this problem, we do a falsification test. And in particular, we change our main dependent variable. And instead of focusing on local consumption amenities, we focus on activities that are related to gentrification. And we pick liberal professional activities. Those activities has been obtained or has been selected due to a new published paper in the Review of Economic Studies that picks or select which are the pioneer business related with gentrification. So we don't find any effect of the arrival of Airbnb in those activities. So this gives us more confidence that Airbnb maybe is not related with gentrification and it's not colocalized with the gentrification. Also, we want to see here whether our main tenants hold when we change the way that we measure Airbnb. Over the paper, we are using the number of Airbnb rooms, but we could use other metrics like the number of listings, the number of bedrooms, the capacity of the listings. So as you can see here, our main tenants hold when we change the way of measuring the dependent variable. The results are ordered from the largest aggregation unit to the smaller aggregation unit. That's why the coefficient is larger for the listing and is lower for the guest. Here, it's more fair to compare the Airbnb guest variable with a proxy for the tourists and the population with a proxy of the residents. But again, we find that in magnitude, it's much higher. Even both are significant, the one for the tourists, as it was expected. Well, now we want to do a series of checks to see the validity of our ID strategy. So another potential problem is that it may be the case that it is not the gentrification, the one confounded that is driving our result. It might be not the case that is our specification form that is driving our result. But it could be the case that Airbnb is localizing in those neighborhoods, in those census tracts, that before the arrival of Airbnb, they were already growing. So Airbnb is entering in those areas that they were already experimented an increasing trend in the consumption amenities. So it was not Airbnb the one who is behind Airbnb, behind the increase in the local consumption amenities. So to try to rule out this concern, we trying to do a kind of event study where we interact a dummy variable for those neighborhoods with a high number of Airbnb with a time dummy variable. Let me tell you that the outcome variable will be the employment because the number of consumption amenities, we don't have data before 2014, but we have data for the employment of this in those consumption amenities before 2014. So as you can see here, we don't find the system, we can rule out the system of a different trend in the increased number of consumption amenities, in the increased number in employment in those consumption amenities in those neighborhoods where the number of Airbnb was high. Well, finally, we want to see here in this last check whether our results, depending of the exogenous variation created by our main shared instrument, the number of rented houses. So we will use and we will explore different sources of exogenous variation using different types of shared instruments. For instance, we will use the number of total dwellings, the number of empty houses, the proportion of the rented houses, and the proportion of the rented houses plus the proportion of empty houses. So for instance, those two instruments, the proportion will rule out the potential problem with the instrument that maybe our instrument is confounding the population. We are using the number of rented houses, but the number of rented houses in a census tract will be higher in those census tracts where there are high number of residents. So here we use the proportion to rule out this potential problem. Again, we find a positive and significant effect of the arrival of Airbnb on the consumption amenities. The only specification that we don't find any effect is for the empty houses. Even though an empty house once Airbnb entry increase the opportunity cost of being an empty house, mainly this variable is related with the private areas. So that's why we don't find any effect. Well, over this analysis, as I say, we have ruled out a potential problem of a specification form, a potential problem of a confounder related with gentrification, a potential problem of the way that we are measuring our main variable of interest, and also a potential problem of the system of pretense. However, we still have a problem, and it's due to the way that we are measuring and the main geographical unit of analysis that we are using. We are using the census tract. As you can see, the census tract are quite small unit of analysis. This is good in the sense that if you are expecting local effects using a small unit of analysis, it's better in order to identify more precisely those effects. But it raises some problem of spatial spillovers. And the problem of spatial spillover follows the following story. An Airbnb user that has the flat in census tract I could or might consume in the census tract J, that is neighbor to the census tract I. If this will be happening systematically, we will be getting a bias coefficient in the other specification. That's why we decided to include as another regression and also instrument for this new regression, the weight average number of Airbnb rooms in the neighbors of the census tracts. So in the of the neighbors of the census tract I, we compute the weight average number of Airbnb rooms. And we select those neighbors using different spatial weight matrices. For instance, a discrete matrix like a cutoff distance matrix, we choose 300 meters, a continuous matrix like the inverse distance, or a discrete matrix like the rook or queen. Rook may reference to the rook move in the chess, like we choose the neighbors in the bottom, in the up, in the left, and the right, and the queen, apart from this, we choose the vertices. Again, regardless of the specification that we use, we can rule out the system of spatial spillovers. So we can confirm that the census tract, at least, or on average, is the right geographical unit of analysis, the regression. Well, finally, what we are trying to see here in the last checks, try to answer two main concerns of this paper. The first concern is that, okay, you are using the census tract because it's an statistics trick. You have a lot of observation. You know that the census tract is, you will have more observation than using neighbor, and this is lowering your standard errors, and you are getting a significant coefficient because of it. But another concern, it could be that, okay, maybe Airbnb, the effects of Airbnb doesn't localize only to the census tract, but also to the neighborhoods or to other geographical units of aggregation. So that's why here we reproduce the same specification as before, that using the dependent variable, the number of food and beverage establishment, but using different levels of aggregation. We will use here for the whole and the restricted sample, the neighborhood, and also for the whole and the restricted sample, the transport zones. Transport zones are a midway aggregation unit in terms of size between the neighborhoods and the census tracts. Again, even though the magnitude of the coefficient change, we still find a positive and significant effect of the arrival of Airbnb on the evolution of those consumption abilities. Well, let me finish the presentation with the usual conclusions. Firstly, the main takeaway of this paper is that we saw the system of local effects, that the arrival of Airbnb into a census tract translate to one more restaurants, and also we find positive effect not only in the number of consumption amenities, but also we find positive effect on employment. So here we are being silent about the other activities. So in this paper, I want to try to stress out, we are only focusing on the consumption amenities, because other activities can be being also beneficiated by the Airbnb, but also might be hampered because of the arrival of Airbnb. Well, also the second takeaway of this paper is that the effects of Airbnb are not homogeneous across the space, are higher in the periphery of the cities than in the city center. And this reinforces the idea that the peer-to-peer accommodations, short-term rentals, can be used to redistribute the tourist consumption over the city. In fact, this paper provides economic evidence in favor of the regulation that is already taking place in cities like Madrid or Barcelona that didn't treat those cities as a single unit. So they restrict the number of certain rentals depending on the area. They allow it in the periphery, but they restrict it in the city center. And this paper provides economic evidence in favor of this kind of regulation for two reasons. Firstly, because by restricting the supply in the city center, you may decongest the city center of tourists, but at the same time, you are allowing that Airbnb operate in those areas where the economic spillover effect is the higher. So you get two effects. Well, thank you so much for listening to me. And if you have any question, I'll be grateful to answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alberto, for your interesting presentations. I guess that if someone could raise some questions, comments, should came here just to make questions or comments. Anyone that would like to ask? Typically, yeah. Okay, Andrea Belmartino, we typically gave the priority to the students, so they are allowed to raise their questions. Andrea Belmartino, do you want to come here? And then
thank you for thank you for the presentation. I don't know the literature, so maybe for that reason have no sense. But I was thinking that first, I was curious about the time period. You're using from 2014 until altogether 2018, or you are also exploiting the time variation?
It's the time variation. It's from 2014 until 2018 in a quarterly basis.
Okay,
So
because I was thinking, because I don't know if you have like not a crisis, but maybe kind of crisis, you have an increase on the offer because people try to make money putting the Airbnb, and also the contrary effect on the in the restaurants. This is the first point. The other, I was thinking, I like that you divide the city center and the rest, but I was wondering also if maybe other tourist attractions can attract the Airbnb. For example, I know a stadium, museum, or for example, the train station. Maybe if you can control for this, because maybe this also attract both. I don't know, thinking on the main station. And the other was, but I don't know if you have the data about tourists, because maybe could be also the effect that could vary from age. I don't know, thinking, for example, that young people is more used to go to Airbnb. I don't know if you can exploit this. So, yeah, thank you again. It was really interesting.
Okay, the first question, that we try to deal with this question about the crisis and also the economic recovery, because you think about it, we are picking the years that is 2014, 2018, where the economy was starting to grow. So we try to solve for this question when we use when we do the parallel trend exercise, with the event study exercise. So what we are doing here is to try to check whether in those neighborhoods where there were a high number of Airbnbs, even before the arrival of Airbnb, they were experimenting an increase in the number of consumption amenities. So as you can see here, the coefficient is 0, so we can rule out the existence of pre-trends in those neighborhoods. So we try to deal with the problem of the economic recovery, economic crisis during this kind of exercises. The second question about the tourist attraction is quite a nice question, because we already are incorporating in a new version of this working paper, because at the beginning we decide, okay, we have to be honest, so we decide to remove all the observation in the city center, because in Madrid almost all the tourist attractions are in the district center, almost. So instead of removing the census tract or the neighborhoods where there were higher tourist attraction, we decided to take a more strict measure and remove it. But in this second version of the working paper, we are doing as you just suggested. And we also removed the area of the Real Madrid Stadium, that is almost one of the few tourist attractions that are outside this area that we are not removing. So yes, in the next version of this working paper, we are doing another robustness check that apart from removing the city center, we remove the census tract outside the city center, but have at least some tourist attraction, and this tourist attraction we identified it using TripAdvisor information. And from the third question, we don't have information regarding socio-demographic for the Airbnb users. I mean, this information only have Airbnb, but it's impossible to edit.
Okay, other questions from the students? I know let me finish with the students before, and then we move to the faculty members. Otherwise, we can open the floor even to the faculty members, and then if the students would like to raise other questions, they can come here and raise questions. Okay, Hugo. Who is okay? There is someone in.
No question
on Zoom. No. Okay, Hugo, now it's your turn.
Thanks for the presentation. I think what I have a problem with your conclusion and perhaps also with your assumption. I think what you consider as a positive externality, the rising number of the growth in number of consumption amenities can be seen on the other side of the coin as a negative externality, because this leads to a loss of retail diversity, and it basically kills traditional activities. So the fact that the suggestion you are making about spatially redistributing, limiting some areas in order to redistribute the presence of Airbnb listings, it can be very dangerous, because it can spread this killing of retail diversity all across the city. So it can lead to entirely colonize the urban space along this line. So I think you should consider not just the growth in, which means also precarious jobs. I mean, in food and beverages activities, like in Venice, in Barcelona, the quality of jobs is very low. The salaries are very low. So I don't think we can understand this in terms of positive externality. And especially because all the retail activities that are aimed at local residents will disappear. So it's, I think your assumption should be also understood against this background. Thanks.
Okay, regarding your comment, I mean, we are actually working in a follow-up paper that analyzed what you say, whether this is a displacement effect of Airbnb in the retail sector. But as I say, in this paper, we want to focus only in the local consumption amenities. And we decided to not tackle other issues because the paper was already lengthy, and we decided to focus only on this research question. But we are working a following paper to try to check whether, as you are saying, is true, whether Airbnb maybe is behind the displacement of the local business. And it could be this a problem. Again, the main takeaway of this paper is not that the Airbnb is increasing the local consumption amenities within the city. Because it's increasing the local consumption amenities in those areas where there are less tourists. It is true that in those areas where there are less tourists, it could be the case that the increase in those consumption amenities are due to a displacement effect, but also it could be that they are a net effect, that they come from establishment that they were closed before and now they open. At the end, Airbnb in those areas can be seen as a shock or a new inflow of tourist income that gets more redistributed across the city. So it could be the two cases. And now we're working this to try to solve for this puzzle, whether the increase in the concessionalities in the periphery is due to a displacement effect or is due to a net effect that some shops that they were closed in the past, now they are open due to the new inflows of tourism thanks to Airbnb.
Okay, other questions, comments? Otherwise, I have some points on your papers. First of all, I need some clarification on the identification strategy, because you mentioned it's quite easy to contest the identification strategy, you know, but I need some other information, because you mentioned that your Bartik index and the shift share instrument that you're going to use is based on the fact that you have the number of rooms before the coming of Airbnb.
The number of rented houses.
Renting houses, but not Airbnb houses
No.
or rooms.
Number of rented houses that were in the rental market.
Okay, and then you have the shift based on the number of search based on Google
Of the world
worldwide or Airbnb. Okay, I think there is. I like this strategy. I don't want to contest this idea, but the point is that it's something that also related to something that you mentioned at the end of your presentation, that is MAUP, the modifiable aerial unit problem, because when you are comparing, especially census tract areas, you have that typically, I don't know Madrid, I look at the map, but I really don't know what is the impact of this issue, if any, in your analysis, because when you have, you work with this type of units, typically in the city center, they are quite small, or they are smaller than the area, the peripheral areas.
The census tracts.
Yeah, right. Because the peripheral areas are quite larger, so they typically,
yes,
the census tract typically to enlarge even the areas. And you don't have any control variables, for instance, on the sides of the units.
I mean, at the end, we are including census tract fixed effects. So
yeah, okay.
All time invariant, the size, the density is controlled.
That's true. But an issue could be that if you compare, even the density is different in these two types of areas, and even the number of rented houses could be different because of the size of the census tract. So my basic point, the very final idea is that probably you can also try to look at the housing density or something like that, because you are just having a look at the absolute value of the houses or
yes,
the numbers.
Yes, this is a good question, because this is a question that they have been arised several times when we were presenting this paper, and we tackle this issue here. When we do the robustness check for the different instruments, here instead of using an absolute number, we use the proportion.
Okay.
That is the number of rented houses over the number of total dwellings. So we are trying to rule out.
So it's a density.
Exactly, it's a density. The potential problem, as you say, maybe it could be that in the city center there are more. I don't know, they are higher or larger the census tract, and there are more rented houses, and that's why we are predicting the city center. But that's why we use the proportion of the rented houses.
Yeah. And another issue is something that you already mentioned at the end of the presentation. Probably, I know that you don't have so much time, so typically all these issues and questions are typically left at the conclusion. But you mentioned gentrification, and you mentioned that you have the percentage of foreign population and blah, blah, blah. By the way, I'm wondering whether you could also have information on income because for gentrification, income is another measure. So in the sense that, the decrease of foreign population or the increase of non-foreign population, but the other proxy for gentrification could be the income. I don't know if this variable is available for Madrid. I really don't know, but could be interesting also to look at the income, because could be another driver for these research questions and for this paper. So this could be interesting to know. I would know the answer for Italy, because you don't have this kind of data, at least for census tract level, for so much time in this particular area. But probably you could also have open data of the city that could leave this such type of data. I don't know. This is just a suggestion that is, because if you, of course, you mentioned gentrification, but also Andrea before mentioned other type of amenities that could be something that is related or partially related to some basic issue related to income, gentrification.
Yes, it's a good suggestion. Actually, I think those two suggestions that you give to us are the ones that are more, they tell us several times. So actually in this,
so I'm not alone.
No.
Saying this one.
So you have a right to the same conclusion that other people to point in this direction. And actually in the new version that we are working now, this working paper, we are including the income variable.
Okay.
We have getting this information that it was a bit difficult, but now we have the income variable to include it as another regression to control from this potential gentrification issue.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Other questions, Andrea?
And Alberto, for the presentation. You presented a lot of very interesting material. Well done. I have follow-up questions / suggestion on what Ugo was mentioning, and also in connection to some of your empirical solutions to the endogeneity problem. So I would actually start from this. As you probably know, this shift share Bartik style instruments are increasingly subject to a lot of criticisms, especially in their geographical component, because usually when you assign something, your variable geographically to something that happened before your sample, but it's basically the same variable, this suspicion is that you have some sort of path dependency in the phenomenon, and that's serially autocorrelated with itself in a way, right? If I think you have a lot of material to frame the paper a bit better than you did, because you said my contribution is in terms of the data and the identification strategy. I don't think that this is the type of instrument that it's super solid. I mean, I don't want to discuss the strength of the instrument here, but I think you can frame the paper better, because otherwise, if you say that's my contribution, I think it's easy to attack that paper. And I go to Ugo's point. I think there's plenty of opportunities here to say something a bit more than what you're doing. For instance, the displacement discussion, the crowding out of people. We don't know whether these new employees come from the same neighborhood, from another neighborhood, from another city. So you're giving a sort of partial equilibrium kind of picture here. But if we consider a general equilibrium picture at the urban level, we don't really know whether this is really positive along the lines that Ugo was mentioning. And so I think you have more room for saying my contribution is not just the data and the empirics, because I think that could be, depending on where you want to submit this, that could be easy to attack. I think that instrument can be easy to attack, although you have a lot of checks and it's convincing in the end. One thing that I was thinking you're probably missing, though, is some alternative forms of short-term rentals, because B&Bs are not just Airbnbs, right? So there's normal B&Bs as well that you're not capturing here, and that can be a confounding factor too. You can pick up on the effect of the normal B&Bs, bed and breakfast. I don't know if you thought about that. And then I'm not sure about one of the falsification tests that you did, the one with the professional activities. I don't know if you can go back to that. I'm not sure about this because professional, scientific, technical activities, finance and insurance are traded across space, while restaurants and coffees are traded only in the local area. You don't kind of export meals on the other side of the city. But if I want to go to a lawyer or to a, I don't know, financial guy on the other side of the city, I can. So I think the tradability of the restaurants and coffees is very different from the tradability of these ones. So I'm not sure exactly what you want to show here, but I think focusing and thinking better about the tradability of different services might be relevant. Another untraded service that you might think of, if you want to really compare it with restaurants and services, might be, I don't know, the barber shop or these other things that are very local. People go to the barber shop usually in their neighborhood, but you can go to a lawyer or to an architect in another neighborhood, right? So I think the tradability of services plays a role here. Yeah, so that were my comments.
Okay. I mean, at the beginning, we decided to use these variables because it has been just shown that they are related with identification. So we decided to choose some variable that increase with identification. And if Airbnb is also, it coincides in space with identification, we will expect an increase of those variables. But as you say, there is a problem in this falsification test that is the tradability. So maybe I should complement with another column in this table, choosing a tradability sector. So this is okay. Regarding the potential confounder or other short-term rentals, we may have information of another short-term rentals, but the problem is sometimes Airbnb, in the Airbnb platform, they are in the Airbnb platform and in other platforms. So they are quite overlapping. That's why we choose Airbnb as is the lead in the sector. I don't remember the figures in the paper, but we say that Airbnb controls all the market. That's why we only focus on Airbnb. Later on, regarding the path dependence, it is true that in the Baltic instruments usually have the problem of the path dependence. For instance, in the immigration literature, if you use the past settlements, of course, the past settlement is related with the actual settlements. But here we make a kind of twist because the past settlement of Airbnb doesn't exist. We use the rented houses, so there is not this kind of path dependence than in the immigration literature. The only thing that changed is that before there were a residents and now there is a tourist, and the change from resident tourist provokes a change in the economic activity surrounding. But I agree with you that even though it is a contribution, I should not focus only on the methodology contribution.
Okay, other questions? Even online, some questions or comments? No. Okay, I think we can stop here. Thank you very much, Alberto, for being with us.
Thank you.
And that's it. Okay, guys. Bye-bye and see you to the next seminar of the next week. Okay. Is it your laptop or
no,
our laptop? Okay.
I stopped sharing.
Yeah.
Can I take it like this,
Sure.
or because with the max I'm totally lost?
I am not okay. Typically, you can do in just a second. It was a touch. No. Okay, grazie. I don't know. I think you can roll me over and end it.
Grazie.